Noah Carter was 14 when the town decided he no longer belonged. Barridge was the kind of coastal village where everyone knew your name, your business, and your mistakes. It had always survived on fishing, cod in the summer, haddock in the fall, hope in the winter. But that year the sea had been cruel. 2 boats were lost in storms. Nets came back empty. Bills piled up. And when people grow scared, they look for someone to blame. Noah's family was an easy target. His father had drowned the previous year under strange circumstances. Calm water, clear skies, a boat found drifting with no one inside. Whispers followed. His mother held on for a while, taking in laundry and sewing torn coats for neighbors. But sickness took her too. Tuberculosis, the doctor said. The word spread faster than the truth. By November, Noah lived alone in their small, weather-beaten shack near the edge of town. He kept quiet, went to school when he could, worked odd jobs when anyone would hire him. But people crossed the street when they saw him coming. Mothers pulled their children inside. Men shook their heads and muttered words like bad luck and curse. The meeting was held in the town hall on a night when freezing rain coated the wooden steps in ice. Noah wasn't allowed inside. He waited under the weak glow of a street lamp, his thin jacket soaked through, his hands numb around the strap of a canvas bag. Inside, voices rose and fell. Fear sounded louder than reason. When the selectman finally came out, he wouldn't meet Noah's eyes. "You need to leave by morning," he said stiffly. "It's for the good of the town." Noah didn't argue. He didn't beg. He just nodded once, as if the decision had already been made long before the vote. That night, he packed what little he owned. A dull knife his father once carried, a folded blanket, a box of matches wrapped in oilcloth, and a book his mother had loved, a guide to coastal wildlife with worn pages and careful notes in the margins. No food. There was none left to take. Before dawn, Noah slipped out of Barridge. He followed the shoreline north, keeping close to the rocks where no one could see him. The wind cut through his clothes. Salt stung his eyes. Every step away from town felt heavier than the last, not because of the cold, but because this was the only place he had ever known. As the gray morning light spread across the water, a memory surfaced. Years ago, his father had brought him to a hidden cove, reachable only when the tide was low. There was a narrow path down the cliff and a dark opening in the stone. "Remember this place," his father had said. "Someday it might matter." Noah didn't know if it would save him. He only knew it was somewhere the town would never look. And so, with fear in his chest and determination in his stride, Noah turned toward the cliffs, toward the sea, toward the unknown, and toward a future no one else believed he could survive. The path down to the cove was steeper than Noah remembered. Loose stones shifted under his boots, and sharp wind rushed up from the water below. When he finally reached the bottom, his lungs burned and his hands shook, not just from the cold, but from the reality of where he was. The cove was narrow, hidden between 2 tall rock walls. At low tide, a strip of rough beach appeared like a secret doorway. At high tide, the ocean swallowed it whole. The cave waited at the far end, dark and silent. Noah hesitated at the entrance. It smelled of salt and stone. The sound of waves echoed inside, hollow and distant, like something breathing. He stepped in anyway. The tunnel sloped upward, and after several yards, it opened into a wide chamber. Light filtered in from the mouth of the cave, painting the granite walls in dull silver. Noah set his bag down and took a slow look around. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't deadly cold either. The rock held a steady chill instead of the sharp bite of the wind outside. The floor was dry. No dripping water. No snow blowing in. For the first time since leaving Barridge, Noah felt something loosen inside his chest. This could work. The first night was brutal. He spread his blanket over bare stone and curled up in his jacket. Every sound made him flinch. The crash of waves, the whistle of wind through cracks in the ceiling, the distant cry of seabirds. Hunger gnawed at his stomach. Fear kept him awake. By morning, his hands were stiff and his mouth tasted like salt. He went out at low tide and searched the rocks. Mussels clung to the stone in tight clusters. Small crabs hid in shallow pools. He remembered the book his mother had loved, how she used to read him parts about the shore, what could be eaten, what to avoid, how the tide ruled everything. He cracked the mussels open with a rock and ate them raw. They were rubbery and bitter, but they filled the hollow ache inside him. Each day followed the same pattern. When the tide went out, Noah worked. He gathered driftwood. He pulled seaweed from the rocks and laid it in the cave to dry. He climbed into the trees above the cove and broke off dead branches, dragging them down one careful armload at a time. When the water rose, he stayed inside. He learned the cave's moods, the way smoke drifted toward a narrow crack in the ceiling, the spots where moisture gathered and the ones that stayed dry. He built a small fire pit from flat stones and fed it slowly, guarding every match like gold. At night, he read by the gray light at the entrance of the cave. The book spoke of tides, currents, and creatures that lived between sea and land. To anyone else, it would have been interesting. To Noah, it was a manual for survival. He memorized which plants could be eaten, which shells meant food and which meant poison, which birds meant storms were coming. But the hardest part wasn't the cold or the hunger. It was the silence. No voices, no doors opening, no footsteps on the road. The world had narrowed to rock, water, and sky. Some nights he thought of Bay Ridge, of warm kitchens and lamplight in windows, and the pain hit so suddenly he had to bite his lip to keep from crying out. Still, something inside him changed. He was no longer waiting to be rescued. He was building something, piece by piece. He stacked stones to block the wind. He layered seaweed and pine boughs into a thick bed. He learned to move with the tide instead of against it. The cave was no one's home by choice. But to Noah, it became proof that he had not vanished from the world. He was still here, still breathing, still learning. And somewhere beneath the fear and the cold, a stubborn belief began to grow. If the sea could be understood, then maybe it could be survived. Winter tightened its grip on the coast. The wind grew sharper, and the waves slammed harder into the rocks, sending cold spray deep into the cove. Some mornings Noah woke to a thin skin of ice along the cave walls. His fingers cracked and bled from salt and cold. His meals stayed small: mussels, bits of seaweed, the occasional crab when luck was kind. Survival had become routine. Comfort had not. One afternoon, during a low tide that pulled the ocean farther back than usual, Noah explored the eastern edge of the cove. He had avoided that area before. The rocks there were jagged, and the footing was dangerous. But something about the way the water drained caught his eye. A narrow channel cut through the stone, hidden when the tide was high. Now it stood exposed, leading to a shallow pool trapped behind a natural wall of rock. Noah stepped closer. The water in the pool shimmered with movement. Fish. Not tiny sculpins like the ones he sometimes managed to catch, but real fish. Thick-bodied, silver-brown, flicking their tails in tight circles. They had been carried in by the tide and left behind when the ocean pulled away. Noah froze, afraid they would vanish if he moved too fast. They didn't. He waded in, heart pounding, and reached down with both hands. The water was freezing. The fish were fast. He slipped twice and nearly fell, but on the third try, his fingers closed around something solid. A fish thrashed in his grip. Noah laughed out loud, the sound bouncing off the cliffs. It was the first time he had laughed since leaving Bay Ridge. He caught 4 that day, then 2 more. Back in the cave, he built a larger fire than usual and laid the fish on hot stones. The smell filled the chamber, rich, oily, alive. He ate until his stomach hurt and then wrapped the rest in dried seaweed. That night, warmth reached places in his body the cold had claimed weeks ago. The pool became his secret. Each high tide brought new fish. Each low tide trapped them again. Noah learned to read the water, how strong tides meant better chances, how storms pushed more fish into the channel. He stacked stones to guide them into tighter corners. It wasn't fancy. It didn't need to be. For the first time, food wasn't a question mark. He began to save what he couldn't eat. He hung thin strips of fish near the back of the cave where smoke could reach them without choking the air. The fire burned low and slow. Days later, the meat hardened and darkened, turning into something that would last. Security. The word felt strange in his mouth, but real in his hands. As December turned to January, Noah grew stronger. His cheeks filled out. His steps became steadier on the rocks. He spent mornings tending the trap and afternoons studying the shoreline, noticing where currents bent around stone and where birds circled above the water. The book his mother loved became more than comfort. It became a guide. He matched its drawings to the life in his cove. He learned which seaweeds gave energy and which made him sick, which birds meant fish were near, which clouds meant trouble. The sea was no longer just a threat. It was a system. One gray morning, as Noah reset his stone trap, he noticed something on the cliff above the cove. Smoke. Not his. A thin ribbon rose from the tree line, faint but unmistakable. Someone had seen his fire. He ducked back into the cave, pulse racing. For weeks, the world had been reduced to water and stone. Now it was widening again, whether he wanted it to or not. Later that day, footsteps scraped along the rocks. A man appeared at the edge of the cove, tall, bundled in a heavy coat, carrying a net over one shoulder. His beard was streaked with gray, and his eyes searched the shoreline with cautious curiosity. Noah stepped out of the cave, knife in hand but low at his side. They stared at each other across the wet stones. "I saw smoke," the man said slowly. "Didn't expect to find a boy." Noah didn't answer right away. He looked at the man, then at the tide pool behind him, alive with fish. The sea had given him a way to live. Now it had brought him a witness. The man's name was Henrik Larsson. He said it carefully, as if expecting Noah to reject it, the way he had rejected Berridge. Henrik was a fisherman who had come to the coast years earlier, drawn by work and by water that reminded him of home. He didn't ask why Noah lived in a cave. He asked how. Noah showed him the pool. He pointed out the narrow channel the tide used like a doorway. He lifted a stone to reveal how the fish gathered where the current slowed. Henrik crouched, studying the water the way other men studied maps. His eyes widened, not with pity, but with respect. "That's a natural trap," Henrik said. "You built on it." Noah shrugged. "The sea did most of it." Henrik came back the next day, and the next. He brought a better knife, stronger line, a small bag of salt. He didn't hand them over like charity. He traded for smoked fish, the way men traded when they wanted to keep their pride. They spoke about tides and birds, and the way storms bent the water around certain rocks. Henrik shared tricks from colder coasts. Noah shared what he had learned from watching this one. Word traveled faster than the tide. By late winter, people from Bay Ridge started showing up at the edge of the cove, quiet, hesitant, wrapped in heavy coats. They stood where the rocks were slick and the wind cut sideways, waiting for Noah to notice them. They didn't apologize, not at first. They asked for fish. Noah sold to them, same price as everyone else, same weight, same look in his eyes, steady, unreadable. He didn't bring up the vote. He didn't bring up the night he left. Business was safer than memory. Still, something shifted. Mothers came with baskets and left with food. Men came with rope and left with knowledge. The winter that had nearly broken Bay Ridge was being held together by a boy they had cast out. One afternoon, a small group arrived together. The selectman, the minister, and two fishermen Noah recognized from the meeting night. They stood in a line like they were waiting for a sentence. "We were wrong," the selectman said, clearing his throat. "The town, we'd like you to come back." Noah listened without moving. The wind dragged white foam across the rocks. Gulls cried overhead. The pool behind him flashed with silver. "I live here now," he said. The minister tried to speak, but Noah raised a hand. Not angry, just firm. "I'll teach you what I know. I'll sell you fish, but I won't move back." They stared at him, confused. Coming home was supposed to be the reward. "This place kept me alive," Noah said. "Bay Ridge didn't." Silence followed, thick and salty. They agreed. Over the next weeks, Noah walked them through the shoreline like a teacher through a classroom. He showed them where currents bent and slowed, how to stack stones so the water did the work, how to smoke fish so it would last, how to read clouds like sentences. Men who had trusted only boats began to trust the rocks. The coast changed them. By spring, Bay Ridge had two kinds of fishermen, those who went out to sea and those who worked the edge of it. The town grew quieter, less afraid. They spoke Noah's name differently now, but Noah stayed in the cove. He fixed the cave's chimney so smoke slipped out clean. He built racks for drying fish and shelves for storing tools. The place that had once been a desperate shelter became something closer to a home. He did not return to the town that had turned him away. Instead, he stood between the village and the water, a living bridge between fear and understanding. Proof that what had been rejected could become what saved them. Years passed and the shoreline learned Noah's footsteps. What began as survival slowly turned into a way of life. Noah built a small cabin above the cliffs for the warmer months, using driftwood and weathered boards traded from fishermen. In winter, he still returned to the cave, the place that had once been nothing but stone and fear, now shaped by patience and skill into something steady and dependable. The fishermen of Bay Ridge no longer looked only to the open sea. They learned to work with the tides, to read the rocks, to understand the hidden patterns along the shore. Storm seasons hurt less. Empty nets became rare. Families slept easier, knowing there was more than one way to live from the water. And the boy they once called unlucky? They now called him the one who understood the coast. Travelers from other towns came to see the cave where a child had survived alone. Some came out of curiosity. Others came because their own villages were struggling, and they wanted to learn what Noah knew. He taught them the same way he had taught Bayrage, without pride, without bitterness, without keeping secrets. Knowledge, he believed, was not something to guard. It was something to pass on. In time, Noah married a woman from a northern town who had heard his story and wanted to see the place for herself. She didn't find a wild boy in a dark cave. She found a thoughtful man who spoke to the sea like an old friend and treated hardship like a lesson instead of a curse. Together, they raised children who learned to read tides before they learned to read books. The cave remained part of their lives, not as a hiding place, but as a reminder. A reminder of what fear had taken and what resilience had built. Bayrage never made a public apology. There was no ceremony, no speech, no plaque in the town square. But the old stories faded. New ones took their place. Children grew up hearing about Noah not as the boy who was cast out, but as the man who showed their parents how to survive. What was once a symbol of rejection became a symbol of quiet strength. And maybe that was justice enough. So here's a question for you. What would you do if the place you trusted turned its back on you? Would you disappear, or would you build something the world couldn't ignore? What hidden resources are around you right now? Places, skills, or knowledge you've overlooked because they don't fit the usual path? And what could happen if you chose to learn from them instead of walking past them? Noah Carter was pushed away when he needed help the most. He didn't become what they feared. He became what they needed. Sometimes the greatest answer to rejection is not anger. It's creation. If this story made you think differently about resilience, community, or the quiet power of knowledge, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more true-to-life stories about ordinary people who found extraordinary ways to survive. Because when the world closes one door, some people don't wait for another to open. They build their own.